I was here 2 or 3 weeks ago, we met a gentleman from Michigan. He had driven down already 5 times this year. He hunts this quite a bit, and they passed up a mature buck. He showed us a video, but you could clearly tell the buck was mature, like a 130-inch buck. And he passed it up, and we asked him, we said, what was that buck doing? He said he was going down for the morning to bed. And even he was like, he's kind of like, it's kind of odd, but he's going down for the morning. So it's exactly what you're saying. A lot of people are thinking top there, but that buck 2 or 3 weeks ago matured. He's been dealing with people, he was going down to bed.
And that's the thing is we talk about the rules for how a deer does stuff. All rules are just vague. You know, you get into an area and maybe because of the way the area lays out, things are a little different. You got to read the area and adjust, you know.
Lights.
Camera.
Follow the trail.
Ready to shoot.
If you know where a deer's bedding and you know where he's eating, that deer should be dead.
Camera.
If you're passive on a deer, what you're doing is you're teaching him.
I've got 30 bucks in the Michigan record book. Everyone but one has had at least one previous wound on his body. Some had as many as 4.
Trail Cam Radio.
From the guys at Exodus.
All right, guys, if you are listening to this on the podcast, I want to apologize just about the audio quality here. We, I just kind of dropped the ball and left the audio equipment at the office. So all we have is a shotgun mic on a video camera, so it probably sounds a little hollow. But the people listening to this, there's going to be a lot to get out of this. So regardless of what the audio sounds like, stay tuned in because this is going to be a good conversation. It is October 28th, Friday morning. It's raining out right now, but we are in Southern Ohio in a tiny little cabin, and I'm sitting with Dan Infalt and Joe Rentmeester. Did I say that right? I always butcher your last name, so I apologize. But we spent the last, 4 days here on a pretty big piece of public, trying to break it down, trying to get on some deer. And we're going to have a conversation about what happened, what went on, what we learned, maybe some things that we did wrong. And hopefully you guys can pull something out of this and, learn from it. So let's just start. I guess, how did we end up here?
I'm tagged out in Wisconsin, wanted to do something, and you kept saying if I wanted to suffer a little bit, I could come down here with you. And it sounded like impossible to kill a deer, so I thought, yeah, that's right up my alley. Let's do that. So we came down here looking at it because it's big woods and hilly, and it sounded intriguing to me to kind of just get out in the woods and chase them in a new area.
And Joe, you've been down here before.
Yeah, I was down here 3 weeks ago, I believe it was, and I wanted to see what it was like at a different time of the year. I'd been down here at this time of the year before, so I was down here prior. I had the tag, and we're about to go do the public land challenge, so I figured, well, if I can get out here for 2 or 3 days and just see if there's any cruising going on, I'd be happy with a good 2-year-old or a nice 3-year-old. So I ran down real quick and met up with you guys.
Didn't you shoot one in the antler down here last year?
Yeah, 2 years ago.
Yeah, so the guys listening to the podcast, I'm super familiar with the area, or relatively familiar with the area. I've run a lot of cameras in the past, but I had no intentions of coming back down here this year. So in the spring, I had pulled most of my stuff out of here. But anytime you get a chance to hunt with either one of you guys, like you gotta jump on it. I mean, just the things that I picked up, scouting with you, Dan, some when to stop, some of the little things that you're catching that I'm not catching. I learned some good shit this week. A lot.
And even likewise, what did you say? You spend 30 to 40 days down here a year. So for me to be able to take your experiences, what you've seen, and tie it in with what I've seen, there's value to that.
Yeah.
My biggest takeaway was the trail camera knowledge you had from over years of running them, and it was pretty impressive what you did down here with trail cameras. You want to kind of give a brief of that?
Yeah. So obviously we have a lot of cameras. We have access to a lot of cameras, right? So when we first started hunting this place back in 2015, we were doing kind of like what anybody else would do. You'd find scrapes or find sign. We'd hang a handful of cameras, and we probably had 25 or 30 cameras kind of scattered out. And we were actually hunting a big deer that year, but the encounters that we were having, they were like next to zero, like one or two. And so next year we decided, like, all right, well, we really got to figure this place out. So we took, we were running at one point in time in 2016, 2017, upwards of 100 cameras down here. But
not just running them during the season, you ran them like all year.
Yeah, so we ran them in longer term sets. And one of the things that we found, I think a lot of guys make this mistake. They set cameras and they go check them every week or every 10 days or maybe every 2 weeks. And then you have these periods after you go into those spots where there's next to zero deer activity, or there's some kind of negative impact around checking those cameras where the deer will shy away from those areas. That, and when you have 100 cameras, you can't just go out and check cameras because there's just too many of them. You'll just never get to any of them or all of them. So what we would do is set these cameras and we would let them run for the whole season. So we would set them up in the summertime, and then we'd go back and check them sometime in the spring. We would just make loops and check them in batches. And what we found was certain cameras in certain areas would get hot in certain times of the year. And that window might only been, sometimes that window was 4 days, sometimes it was a week, sometimes it was 2 weeks. But by doing that, that's when we picked up on like what we call historical data, or those annual patterns, where we could start picking a specific deer and know kind of the area that he was going to be in. And it's not always, I say area because it's not always the same trail or the same scrape, but he's somewhere in that area where we could go in and kind of figure out a game plan on how to hunt that deer. So running those cameras in a longer term manner, which seems odd because people, they want like the most recent information, right? They want, but in a trail camera, you get that pitch, it's already dated. It's already happened. So it's just a specific moment in time. But having that bulk data without it being influenced or negatively impacted by human intrusion taught us a lot about how the deer moved in some of these hills.
So one thing that was interesting to me is you had told me that you weren't seeing the mature bucks in daylight on the tops, which is how most people hunt, is up on the tops.
Yeah.
So for me, that told me that those deer are probably lower on the hills and dropping. And looking at the place, the first thing, even without your camera data, that I saw was most hunters would access on these tops.
Correct.
And even though there's low pressure here, every time a hunter accesses, he goes through the tops. So all those ridges get hunted eventually on the tops during the season. And I think any deer that's got maturity realizes that the people are up high, and if they drop low, they're not hitting people. So for me, what I really wanted to target was middle of the hill or down lower because of that.
Yeah.
And what was nice is that the confirmation because of your cameras.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's we'd run cameras in saddles, like the big terrain features that you normally you'd find on Onyx or a map or whatever. And even though there's sign up on those ridge tops, very rarely did we ever get any big deer, mature deer in daylight. I mean, you'd get the flyers in November that were just up there doing doing their thing, but it was just one-offs. It's not, we would never just go up to a ridge and sit there and wait all day and just hope for one to walk by. But that's how we started hunting here. We'd pick a saddle and you'd sit in that saddle, and it's just like they weren't using those features. So I think when you look at those big terrain features on a topo map, everybody's picking those out. Everybody that's like, hey, there's a saddle, let's go check it out. Like, those are the spots that guys are picking off right away and going in and scouting. So when we ran cameras there, that's where we'd pick up people, just like you said. And very rarely did we ever have any bigger deer use those terrain features in daylight.
I remember when we were walking around scouting, we got into that saddle that had like zero deer activity. Mm-hmm. And you turned to me and you said, you ever see a lot of deer in these saddles? You think that's overrated? And I said, yeah, I think it's overrated. You don't always see deer in saddles. I said, there's situations. I've seen saddles that are awesome, mm-hmm. but it's situational, and I don't see it as consistent as what most people would make it out to be. Yeah. And you said that the cameras just matched that totally.
Yeah. Yeah, I was curious in what you've seen. It's like, I think sometimes data can be manipulated by who's looking at it, and sometimes you can turn it into something it's not. So it's always good to, reference what you're getting, whether from your trail cameras, from what what you're seeing on the stand, your encounters, like how you're scouting, and confirm it to other people and bounce ideas off one another. I think this, I guess let's talk about that lower 1/3, that those lower elevations, lower 1/3 up to halfway up the ridge, I guess. That is where I've had most success here. Mm-hmm. That's where I was hunting for a couple of years, hunting a pretty good one at a lower level. And even a lot of times guys talk about thermals and wanting to hunt that higher elevation during the day. And from what I found, there's spots here that set up on that lower 1/3 that you can still get away with hunting late into the morning without the thermals kind of screwing you. It's just a matter of really finding those spots. But when you find them, I think that's why the deer feel safer there.
That's the one thing that threw me off is I expected a little more activity at top third. However, top third is pretty close to the tops here. And the lower third, almost all these hills in the lower third have a bench, like a logging bench, a logging road bench, and they're not being used by humans. Where where we come from in the hill country, the hills are so huge, every place there's a logging road, there's human activity. And generally the human activity is down low like that. We're here with the activity up high, I think it's forcing them down lower, but it's also making a unique area where you can kill them because thermals are different than the top third. They don't have that wind over the top, rolling back, and thermal where you have 2 or 3 winds at once and swirling down in that bottom, so it's a little easier to hunt down there.
Yeah. Why don't we, while we're on the topic of the lower 1/3 half, talk about the last couple days where we kind of went in and scouted our way from a food source and scouted our way up that upper one, or up that lower 1/3 up to that lower half, because we found some pretty good stuff.
So what me and you did was different than what Joe did. Joe wanted to kill a deer, and I wanted to experience hunting a giant. Yeah. You know, same as you. So Joe went and hunted top third, I think.
Well, I had a day and a half, so for me, you were here for how long? 3 or 4 days?
Yeah.
So you had a little more time to work with. I just wanted to jump into something and be in a tree rather than spend my time scouting. So I jumped into a spot that I was familiar with. Had a good little buck come cruising through. I don't know, what do you call him, 100-inch buck or something like that. So that was nice seeing. Then I spent the day scouting yesterday, and got into the sign. I mean, the sign's there, but yeah, I was on the top.
And when we were out scouting and just navigating to a new area, when we hit that top third on an actual long ridge, which was rare around here, those long ridges.
Yeah, oh yeah.
We found that cruising trail. Matter of fact, we found a shed laying right on it, and that was close to top third.
Yeah.
I mean, it was right where it belonged. So a guy could hunt in that manner and still kill deer. I just think to kill the big ones, the way we went about going up those hills was the way, and following the food sources back and looking where the does were, and then following the buck sign back. And this week of October, to me, is the best time because that sign just starts showing up. It's just followable now. And now we can get into where those bucks are now instead of seeing that sign in a week and then the deer might be chasing some doe during rut, 2 miles away.
Yeah.
Now you can follow that sign right to the buck.
If we were, being the end of October, if we were another week forward, I think, as you said, some of those cruising elevations, I think you can sit there and have some success. Yeah. It just depends on, I guess, what you're after here. I think, and a camera said the same thing. Those younger deer, the 2, 3, and even some 4-year-olds, because there's not a whole lot of pressure here. They will use that upper 1/3, and you get on that, and sometimes it's not even, which is weird. It's not always on the leeward side. The wind here, it just does. You don't have those long straight ridges like you said, and there's times where the wind, even though the weatherman might say it's coming from the west, the way it's hitting terrain or something, it's not always what the weather guy.
Yeah, you're getting some of those valleys, and it's always east. No matter what way the wind blows, it's always east.
Right, and that's what I was saying about that one spot that I was hunting previously. Like, it didn't matter what the wind was doing; it was always some kind of south, either southeast or southwest. But it was always coming from the south, which is for a guy to come in here, like on a 7-day vacation trip. It's like that's really hard for somebody to figure out because you're not going to know until you get in there and hunt it a couple of times.
It's funny. When I was here 2 or 3 weeks ago, we met a gentleman from Michigan. He had driven down already 5 times this year, and he hunts this quite a bit. And they passed up a mature buck. He showed us a video, but you could clearly tell the buck was mature, like 130-inch buck. And he passed it up, and we asked him. We said, "What was that buck doing?" He said he was going down for the morning to bed. And And even he was like, he's kind of like, it's kind of odd, but he's going down for the morning. So it's exactly what you're saying. A lot of people are thinking top third, but that buck 2 or 3 weeks ago matured. It's been dealing with the people. He was going down to bed.
And that's the thing is we talk about the rules for how a deer does stuff. All rules are just vague. You know, you get into an area and maybe because of the way the area lays out, things are a little different. You got to read the area and adjust, you know?
Well, I think, some of the stuff that we saw the first couple of days, we were spending time basically scouting ridge tops, finding scrapes, finding rubs, stuff that was relatively fresh. One of the things that I've always screwed up is going too far and screwing the spot up. And when we saw that buck from the road that night, and we went back to looked on a map to try to figure out what ridge he was living on, and when we went in there and found those rubs on those pine trees, and the one was relatively fresh, I stopped and I said, Dan, this is where I screw stuff up, because I want to see if there's something better. I want to see what's up on this point, right? Where if there's something better, and that's where I fail. Something I gotta get better at is looking at the map and then stopping right there and trying to determine where that bedding opportunity is on that point. And maybe you hunt it and you don't see anything, but then you're not out of the game totally yet, because you have another shot of maybe going a little bit further, a little bit deeper. Both of you guys, I want both of you guys to answer this, but in your mind, when you come to a spot like that, how do you try to determine this is close enough?
So for me, the first thing I'm doing is I'm popping up my map, and I'm looking and I'm saying, okay, is there a bedding opportunity right here? And then when I see the bedding opportunity, is there a better bedding opportunity further back in the same direction? Or, do I think he's bedding there further back? You got to take a guess. And to some degree, and especially in areas that aren't heavily hunted, I mean, they do not like human scent, and they're going to move, right? So your best crack is that first hunt. Like you said, you get another crack, but then you always got that question: did he come through, smell me? Did he move back? So I'm gonna try and determine: do I believe he's bedded within 200 yards? If I don't, I'm moving. And sometimes I'm wrong. Quite often I'm wrong. But if you don't get ballsy and bump a few of those deer, you're not going to kill deer either. But it is a good question. I do think that sometimes that sign isn't very far. The distance those deer are traveling is very short, especially with mature bucks. And if you see a deer, or a deer was in the area, like we saw that deer just after shooting hours, I don't think it went very far. So I'm thinking it's not very far up. A guy's got to set up relatively quick, and if you determine that you probably went too far, then you just got to get down and go find something new, right?
Right. Yeah. Is that the 200 yard mark? Is that kind of a general?
In hill country,
yeah.
It's harder to get closer than 200 yards in hill country. You get the noisy leaves. They bed often to watch their back trail, and we've seen that. We've seen a lot of bedding where they're watching a human access trail, or they're come back around and they're watching what you're doing, or right above an access trail, and it's hard to get closer than 200 yards. Now, if I'm hunting swamps or something, I'm getting within like 75 yards, within 100. And some of the deer I've shot in swamps have only gotten 75 yards in daylight. You shoot them at closing time and you've watched them get out of their bed. So it really is a tricky thing to get within that window. And a lot of guys think they find all the sign, they read where the bedding is, and it's so great. And we talked about this. And you think you got it made, and a lot of new guys. But really, I mean, how many times do we set up like this a year where we're right on something that's just, it looks perfect, but you fail? I mean, it's probably 100 to 1.
Yeah.
But eventually, all the stars line up and you kill the buck.
Yeah. I think one thing that I picked up on you, or just scouting with you, is around some of these hiking trails that you just said that you deer are set up closer than what most people would think. You get in this big forest and whatever 60, 70,000 acres, and you want to get deep. You want to go where no one else is because you think those deer are in these remote spots, and sometimes they are. But the spot that we've kind of broken down the last couple of days, those, the deer that I saw last night, the night before that, they were does, but even some of the deer that were coming down right at closing were a lot closer than what I would have thunk. I mean,
yeah, I noticed when we got there, you wanted to follow that trail up that hill, and I was nervous. I was like, hey, they might be right at that brush line. They might be right at that brush line.
Right.
Because they'll bed on top of the food sometimes.
Yeah. And there was some human activity there last night. There was a hiker that came through, some other stuff going on, and it didn't phase those deer. Even the deer that came down right at closing time, which they were probably just a little bit higher than where we were set up. If we would have been another 150, maybe 200 yards up that ridge, we probably would have laid eyes on something as far as a buck. But what about you, Joe? What about
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Before we get into it, what ended up happening with that? You talked about the one you saw off the road, and then you went in, and then you pumped the brakes and said, "How far do I go?" What ended up happening there? I wasn't there for that, so curious, I'm sure they are too.
I never. We went in right away. Dan picked up on some doe tracks. There was a doe out there eating acorns close to the road, and as we made our way past this old cut, there was just a really hard edge on the ridge top, and this cut was probably, I would say, it's 10 to 12 years old, like just stemmy stuff, something that too thick for a buck to walk through or use. So we scouted our way into that edge, found one older rub from this year, but older, pretty substantial. And then as we made our way up that ridge, there was some more sign, and we got into two fresh rubs. Well, one was fresh, one was maybe.
Yeah, one was still tacky.
Yeah, still had sap, bleeding. And the other one right next to it was a little bit older, but it was right off a point. And we decided to keep going, keep pushing, and then the sign dried up. So I never went in and hunted that. But as we talked through it, there was no way for that deer, if he was bedded there, I don't think there was no way he would have been where we saw him in that amount of time. Okay. I think it was too far for him to travel. I'm not saying he wasn't up there using it, but
so you could push too deep ultimately.
I don't think we were close enough to him really, but it was kind of he was coming from down in a bowl, and I mean we had to come in from on top of him.
Yeah, I think he was lower.
I don't think we could have cut him off. Okay. So we just moved on to the next one. I mean, he wasn't an absolute giant either. He was probably just a 3-year-old. But I mean, obviously a buck either one of us would have shot.
Got it. That was my question. What was your question?
I was just curious how you know when enough is enough, as far as like pushing in and setting up.
The same way. I mean, sometimes just standing there and looking and seeing what looks like bedding, where could they bed? So like for the viewers, if you go back and look at that buck that Jake and I killed in Michigan, we got to the end of the point. Beyond the point it was water, so they probably weren't in the water. There was all the flooding, and you could look and you could see there wasn't a lot of there wasn't a big canopy up above that would make it open. You could see up ahead that it was just thick, so we knew the bedding was up there, and we had to pump the brakes and give ourselves enough room to have shooting because you could see it got thicker ahead. So sometimes you mentioned the map. Look at the map. Look at what looks.
Look at the wind direction.
Yep.
Look at where the thick starts, right?
Yep. Look at what looks like bedding, but sometimes just standing and looking up ahead and seeing what can they bed in safely. You scout enough, you start to learn these beds and what they'll use.
One of the things I picked up on too is how slow you go sometimes when you're looking at stuff. I have the opposite mindset, was where I want to just cover ground, and this is what kind of bit Cameron and I when we were in Wisconsin, right? We were trying to cover as much ground as we could until we found something and just punched us in the face and said, all right, this is it. Sometimes a lot of times you never find that stuff. One of the things I noticed with scouting with you, Dan, is stopping and looking at sign and like almost breaking it down like this is going to sound kind of corny, but like a crime scene. You're picking up on little nicks on small stuff where an antler just broke a twig or just marred up a tree. It's not a rub, but there's a mark there. So a lot of times you're going in, I'm speaking from my personal experience, going in scouting some of these rub lines and trying to follow where they are, and you might get to a spot where there's 70 yards between a decent rub, but there's all this little stuff in between that I don't pick up on.
Yeah, I noticed that you walk by scrapes without looking at them. I want to see the track size in every scrape.
And that's the other thing. It's like I'll look at a scrape and say, okay, it's old or it's fresh. And where I had that cell camera set up, where we were picking up does coming through there, I actually think the bucks, well, to your point, you pointed out, like, hey, they're skirting, they're going around the back side of this point. Like, look at the scraping direction of this track, and it was lined up from behind the camera. And as we went over there was a trail. I mean, not a heavily used trail, but there was a faint trail that went around the back side of that, and there were some old rubs and stuff in there.
If you think about it, now when we finally got into that area, I mean, what we found was a cornfield that we felt like, I don't know, it's kind of overlooked. It's hidden from the road.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't know about this, and it's kind of remote. Let's go back and check out this cornfield. Well, when we were going back there, we were finding a sign coming into this cornfield from a couple of different ways, and we were thinking about a way to set up. And what I caught was one of those scrapes. There's a whole line of scrapes there, but just one of them had a big track in it.
Yeah.
And the track was headed, from morning, because I felt it was that day, was headed along that corn, going back the way we had came. So that kept haunting me, and that's what actually led to me finding that rest of the sign in the bedding area, because it just kept haunting me, and I ended up going back that way, if you remember.
Yeah, we got to talk about that. Talk about, you were set up when we were hunting relatively close to one another.
Yeah, so we had that corner of the cornfield, the far corner. There was sign coming from a thick top, and there was sign coming from a draw that had several points. And it looked like the sign coming from the draw was better, but there was bigger sign, where it was dropping from the top. And we felt that the thermals were going to drop down that hill in the evening, and I was going to sit up on one side, you the other. We caught that big track, and that was on my mind. But when we got there, we just couldn't beat that little bit of breeze. Was a little stronger than the thermal, and my scent kept blowing over in front of you and a little up the hill. I mean, it would have probably been good if that buck came down the trail with all the big rubs on it, but you wouldn't have killed nothing if it was coming from the top.
Right.
And I just kept thinking about that, and I thought, well, you know what, I'm screwing him up. I think we're too close. If something comes through here, he's going to see it good enough. I want to go back to where we first turned that corner and we saw those scrapes and stuff, and we read it coming this way, because that track was haunting me going the other way. And I just sent you a text and said, I'm out of here, and just got down and went, and I got to that first big scrape, well beyond that track, but the track was going up that scrape line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those scrapes just had 2-year-old tracks in it. But I got there and I'm standing there and I'm looking at it, and I look up, I'm looking for where these deer come from. And we were thinking they were coming up down that valley. But while I was looking, I caught that there wasn't much sign over there. So I started looking around, and I made a faint trail up coming from that scrape up a ridge. And way up there, I could see a big rub. So I'm like, okay, he's coming from above. So I set up right there, figuring he might be up on this hillside up here. The only thing that was bothering me is I knew the human trail went through there, but I also knew that that trail was closed. Right. There was stuff blocking it, and it had been closed. So it probably hadn't been much use. So I set up right there. And that's all. That hunt went, you saw deer.
Yep.
And I didn't see nothing. But you had to avoid some deer to come out.
Mm-hmm. So some does, I was set up on the off side of a point where I could see another point dropping down into this bottom. I had a couple does work down relatively early, a little bit after 6 o'clock, and then they made their way out to that cornfield. But then as it got to closing time, I could hear deer coming down that point and milling around down in that bottom, and I just didn't want to get down and blow everything out, because at that point I thought, well, we're still in the game. We'd come in here tomorrow, scout our way in a little further and get further up on another point and be in the game the next day. So I sat till well after dark before I was able to tear down. And then I ended up moving, the next day I ended up moving in there. But when we went back in the next day, where you picked up on that first big rub, kind of leading up that ridge side, that's where we started scouting.
Yeah, but if you go back to the day before, while I was waiting for you, when you got to me, it was probably about a half an hour after closing, maybe not quite.
Yeah, it was
Up that rub line, we had a lone deer blow at us.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was the next clue, right?
Yep.
So now you can go into the next day.
So the next day we went back, basically back into that bottom where you were set up. Right where the scrape was, you cut that big track. You showed me that rub, and then basically we just followed that faint deer trail up that ridge.
That was cool because that sign just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah. So I'll let you talk about it. I mean, that's where you spent last night. So
yeah, so that's what I was looking for. So really, I got one good hunt out of this trail, and that's typical with me, So we went up that rub line, and we found periodic rubs that were obviously from a mature buck. They were high. You could see by the where the tines were hitting and everything that it was a big rack. We were still hitting those big tracks occasionally, and it's gravelly soil. It's hard to hit tracks, but occasionally you'd hit them where they step in a scrape, and we kept going up, and we went around the side hill, that bottom third again, and it started getting real thick, and the trail, or the logging bench that wasn't being used by humans, wrapped around and went up a draw, and we felt that buck would probably be bedded right around that corner based on the winds and stuff and how it would swirl in there. And when we got up close to that corner, we hit a scrape that was really fresh, had a busted off branch on a rub over the top of it, and the leaves were still real green, and it was compressed, and there was a huge impression of a buck there, where you could see where he laid.
big bed.
And in my determination, that was that day, and we kicked him out of there, or it was the day before. So he had been bedding right there. So we knew we were entering the bedding area. And I just felt like, well, with the wind, it would probably be more likely it was the day before.
Yeah, I agree too.
Yeah. So we crept to the corner, and there was a giant deadfall, this huge tree with a root ball. And then above it was a tree that fell the other way, and it created a funnel of about 20 yards. And there was two main trails coming through there. And when you look through it, you could see a giant rub up further, and you could see that the deer always went through that around that corner. So that's where I decided to set up.
When we got to that spot, you could see kind of your eye. Actually, when we got to that bed, you're like, all right. You could see kind of your eyes get lit up, and I could tell you got excited. But as we made our way up around that corner where those deadfalls were, you're kind of picking up what tree you were going to set up on, and I started asking you questions about, is this deer do you think he's going to come through this gap? Do you think he's going to go around that upper deadfall? And you're like, I don't really know, but we can't go any further because we're going to screw this up. But we just peeked around that corner, and that's when you caught that big rub up on that tree. Now, ultimately, you didn't end up seeing anything.
Yeah.
But,
And nothing showed at all. So either we spooked it when it was blowing at us, or we spooked it when we went in and maybe he was in that bed.
Yeah. Well, the I think other than the obvious sign, the tracks, the scrape, the rub line, but picking up on what time it was the night before when that deer blew at us, like you said, was probably the biggest telltale sign that he was bedded up somewhere in that general area.
Yeah, and that actually kind of convinced me maybe he was around the corner, because that blowing came from about where that bed was.
Right.
So I thought, well, maybe if he got to that point, by that time frame, maybe he was around the corner.
Because that was 20 minutes after. It was probably 20 after 7.
Right.
Probably heard
But
that.
I mean, typically when you're talking mature deer, actual mature deer, 5, 6, 7 years old, I don't see them moving huge distances in daylight.
Right.
It's pretty short window.
You said something about those rubs too, because they were kind of periodic, but it seemed like there was a couple rubs around that hiking trail where
Yeah, they're marking.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit.
So what you see is those rubs, especially pre-rut. I mean, that rub line. Those rubs are in a position for a reason. They're marking something, and they're marking where there's like a stressful situation, like where they're running into another buck, where they're running into a group of does crossing, or they're running into hikers or humans, right? And that hiking trail was marked well, like they're being cautious and nervous about crossing that trail.
And there was other deer sign up that trail too. So it wasn't just the big rubs, but there were some
Small rubs,
stuff.
there's medium rubs, so there's obviously more than one buck using that.
Right.
But it could be that there's one buck at a time, because actually the big buck sign was the freshest.
Yes. Yeah. So after you go in and hunt a spot like that, whether we boogered it up or he just wasn't there, if you had to hunt tonight, what would you do?
If I had to hunt tonight, I'd try to figure out where he moved to, because I think we busted him out of it. I would think he's maybe further up that same ridge and coming off the backside, and I'd try to creep down the backside, getting as close as I can from that direction. And that's a guess.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we did too yesterday was when we cut that big sign and got up there, we thought of both of us trying to set up on that deer, thinking if he was in that bowl, he's going to come one way or the other. So we dropped down into that. We didn't drop down in that bottom. We walked all the way around, very cautious of what our wind and
We put on 4 miles?
4 miles in the morning, just making a pretty big loop. But we went around to the next ridge over, maybe walked 3/4 of a mile before we dropped down in that bottom, just to make sure we weren't our wind wasn't gonna screw anything up.
Looking at that valley, I really kind of expected that if he was on any of those points too, he would just drop down to the hub, because there was 4 or 5 draws that went out of there, and a really remote bottom down there. But I kind of misread the map. I thought it'd be a bigger bottom.
Yeah.
But there was sign of him down there.
Yeah.
He had sign on it, but none of it was fresh.
Right. There was some scraping activity down there.
And some big rubs, a couple
big rubs, which I think, the one rub was on a fairly big tree, and to me it looked like just brow tine marks, like deep aggressive gouges just from brow tines, no other marks kind of around the tree, and then the big track. So that deer was using that bottom at some point. It just wasn't as fresh as what we wanted to see.
Right.
So then we looked at the map and kind of looked at all those points and looked at what I thought would be the point that deer would use coming down into that bottom. It was the least aggressive, had a nice kind of a gentle slope. But and there was a faint trail going up there, but as we got up there, it was really open. It opened up, not a lot of
doe bedding, that was about it.
Not a lot of cover, some doe bedding. But then as we worked our way up towards that upper 1/3, there was an old scrape there. And we only went another, 10 or 20 yards. And it was shredded up there. I mean, there were...
And that was a little fresher.
15, 10, 12 rubs just in a kind of a little pocket there.
Yeah, first they looked old, and then all of a sudden we started hitting some fresher ones.
Yeah.
And it was coming right from the backside where that buck was bedding.
Yeah. So it's, in a scenario like that, if I had more time also, I think, you have that perimeter where I think if you had more time, you could really focus on that and probably break down where that deer probably moved to. Because like you said, we probably boogered him up, bumped him, but he's probably using one of those points somewhere in there.
Yeah. I would say, looking at that stuff too, that deer is making some huge mistakes. If you looked at that rub line, if you saw what I saw, you had old rubs, new rubs, and ancient rubs all together in different stages of time. And you can tell that deer's been doing the same thing year after year after year. And if a guy spent a few days down here and really concentrated in just that area in like January, February, you'd come in here next year and just kill him. the fact that trying to figure this out while you're trying to kill them is a very difficult task.
Yeah. What was some of the sign that you picked up on, Joe? Like hunting that?
Yeah, so now you hunted a different method, I mean, right?
Yes and no. So for me, the first night, I dove into what I was familiar with. I got in here at 3 o'clock. So I dove into what I was familiar with. And what I had, and for people that have watched my Ohio Hunting Beast YouTube video, you could see some of this. But what I had was I had a ridge system. There was a knob, and there were 3 ridges that came off that knob, and each of the 3 ridges created a saddle right there. And you could shoot 2 of the saddles. The other saddle was a little further away. You could see what was going on, but each saddle had a scrape on top of it. So it's your typical rut situation. And previously, when I had hunted that, I had a shooter buck come through, hadn't adjusted my pin, shot the thing in the antler. That was 2 years ago. So I figured I wanted to get in there. On those ridge systems, I'd had my best luck in the mornings. So the first night, I didn't see anything, got right back in there the next morning. Had that buck come through. He came over the top of the one saddle and then checked the other 3 saddles actually, and then cruised out of there. So that was that. I came back that night, talked to you guys.
How big was the buck?
100-inch buck. Just I don't know, 2-year-old, 1.5-year-old. Hard to say, but just nice.
Probably a small 2.
Could be. Yeah. It's hard for me to judge them down here. And then I came back that night, talked to you guys, and I said when I was here in the past, I hadn't had much luck at night. And you said you need to get lower. So then yesterday morning after hunting that, and we talked about cuts as well. And cuts are something I don't deal with at home, so I don't have a lot of experience with it. And I had gotten to a point where there were 2 draws that came down into a little hub. And beyond the hub was like a 2 or 3-year-old cut. And you could see where they were feeding in the cut, little trails going through the cut, and there were deer in there. And I got down in that hub. And hindsight being 2020, I probably should have hunted that last night instead. But I got in there, and there were a bunch of scrapes down below. You could see where they're actually dropping off the top of the point down into the hub, and they were coming down each way. And the way the wind was rolling, I could have made it work. The prevailing winds were kind of rolling into the cut and not up into the bedding. I had fresh sign in there. I got some pictures, a good track and a scrape. There was a rub from, I would say, a 2 or 3-year-old, very fresh. You could see same thing you said. With just the brow tine marks. I don't know what's with that, but that had that kind of sign, and I thought, okay, this is where I'm going to set up tonight. But I had time, so I wanted to go check out some other stuff. And it was a ridge system, and you came in from down below, and there was a draw. So I went up the draw, and as I was going up the mouth of, or I guess you call it the mouth of the draw, when I got to the very top of it, there's a bunch of sign up there again from like a 2 or 3-year-old. We kind of talked about. I showed you some of the rubs. The height of the rubs were low, but it was all on big trees like this. And he had them shredded pretty good. And you could see where this deer was laying. You could see the bedding right at the mouth of the draw where he's looking down where all the people
Right where all that wind swirls.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And I think what that deer had experienced in the past is when I started looking at it, I figured most people were going beyond that draw and going way back. But then when I started looking at it later, I realized a lot of people were doing what I did, and they'd go up that draw and they'd hunt up there. Now, this spot, there was a trail camera up there, and that trail camera I could tell had been there for a few weeks because the guy stuck a bunch of branches in the strap, and you could see the leaves dried up and had been dead for quite a while, so you could tell it had been quite a while since anyone had been up there. But that deer had sign all over the top of that ridge, and that I kicked it around in my head. Where was the sign hotter? The first spot with the cut or that spot specifically? And this sign was just hotter. That deer seemed aggressive. Because he was aggressive, I wanted to be in there. And I was hoping to maybe hunt it this morning too, but it was you'd just be soaked this morning, be miserable. I didn't have any rain gear, but that deer never showed. That was that. Hindsight being 2020, I would have liked to have been in that hub next to that cut. I think that would have been interesting. I think something would have dropped down in there. And the cool part too, that the hub spot with the cut, as you go up that hill, some of the logging they had done had tipped over trees up onto that hill, so there was plenty of bedding up there. It looked really good. But that was what I did with it. I had a day and a half. So that's where I was at.
Yeah, it's pretty tough. I mean, it's tough to come down here in 3 or 4 days and try to figure things out. With a day and a half, that's a pretty tall task.
Yeah, for me, I think that we could have came down here and got on some ridge signs and killed a 2 or 3-year-old pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're already cruising a little bit. I think we could have, especially in the mornings. But I really wanted to hunt giant bucks, and I kind of liked your history with the giant bucks on the cameras. And I had a blast. I mean, just being in the driver's seat last night in that tree was fun, even though I was in pouring rain. But
Yeah, it rained pretty good last night.
I got some footage, and the footage talking to the camera, you probably can't even see me because the whole camera's clouded up and soaked. And,
Well, overall, I think it was a fun trip. I think if we would have got to the spot we spent the last couple of days, if we would have been there earlier, I think we probably would have had a better opportunity to having, breaking that spot down a little bit deeper and having some more buck encounters. But
yeah, it might be a big area, but there's only so many places you can hide.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I mean, it's so spread out that it can take you hours and hours and hours to get to the spot to scout it. So you need more time.
Well, that's one of the things we talked about yesterday. We scouted from the morning and didn't get back to the truck until almost 1 o'clock. And I had said that this place it takes you so long to cover any ground. It's really hard to, I think sometimes you're better off focusing on a smaller spot and going through it a little more thorough than trying to figure the whole thing out in the big picture.
Yeah.
So maybe moving forward, maybe that'll be my more of my strategy rather than going in and trying to break down a big chunk, but just go and kind of scout these micro areas or these smaller areas, and then you can kind of cross them off your list and kind of figure out what's going on.
I think it definitely showed me this week that this terrain, you need to go from the bottom and scout your way up.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was pretty evident that if you go from the top and try to scout your way back, number one, those big bucks aren't running the tops; they're going down. So you're just going and you're pushing them. You could set up right above them and have them drop on you, but most of them were dropping. I think that might change on an acorn year, but there's no acorns this year influencing.
Not very many, no. Which is odd because you walk around these woods and there's acorns there's acorns on the ground everywhere, and that's one of the things you and Joe were talking about. Like, what kind of acorns are these? We don't have these kind of acorns. I'm like, those are from last year. Those are rotten.
See, that's something that might sound funny to some people, but me and Joe really haven't experienced that. Those acorns look good to us. Acorns don't stay on the ground in Wisconsin. There's just too many deer.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have acorns that make it to the next year. Either squirrels bury them or they get eaten.
Yeah.
So seeing acorns laying all over the place, I had no idea they were rotten. I was even telling you you're wrong. Watch, I bite one in half. I'm like, oh, that is rotten.
Yeah.
Then I go pick up another one, bite it in half, and it was rotten. And then when you look, you can see they're starting to grow.
You got the sprouts coming out of the
Right
tips
out of
or
the
out
tip.
the end.
Yeah, I didn't realize it.
And I bet you a lot of people watching this, they're like, well, you don't know that? But I didn't.
Well, you come to a new spot, new environment, new terrain, new habitat, and you learn just those little things. But ultimately, you build up those scenarios and put them in the back of your mind, and that's how you learn to be versatile. So, overall, it was a good trip. I'm not sure. I'm 99% sure I'm not coming back down here this year. Maybe some postseason stuff. So most of my hunting in Ohio will be done around the house from here on out. But learned a ton. We'll just bank it in memory. And
if I come back, it's because I tagged out in Indiana early, and Joe tagged out in Indiana early. And
well, hopefully that happens. Hopefully that happens. You guys get back here and you can get back on that big deer.
Yeah,
that'd be pretty cool. So appreciate everybody tuning in, checking this out. If you haven't already, just leave us a review, man. We say this at the end of every podcast, but it helps us grow tremendously. It helps us find and reach new listeners. As you guys leave these reviews, it helps us kind of grow the podcast, climb those rankings, and let new people find us. So if you guys would take 5 minutes, I'd be humbled and gracious if you could do that for us. So until next time.